Welcome to Lesson 5 of Section 10 for the BJCP training program from the Brewers Anonymous Homebrew Club. We are continuing our discussion on wort production. This is Lesson 5, and this is all about boiling. The boiling phase of brewing does several important things for our beer. It extracts, isomerizes, and dissolves the alpha acids from our hop additions during the boil or any hops that we added in a first wort hopping step. It stops the enzymatic activity and conversion of the residual starches to sugars. It kills bacteria, fungi, and wild yeast that may be in the wort and provides a sterile environment for the yeast when we are ready to pitch. It coagulates proteins and polyphenols in the hop break. Boiling evaporates the harsher oils from our hops and boils off sulfur compounds, ketones, and esters. And the boil evaporates the water in the wort, condensing it to the brewer's target volume and gravity. All right, let's get into this part of the boil and probably the most contentious part of the exam material, and that is the 60-minute boil. The BJCP exam study material really only addresses a 60-minute boil, and that doesn't bother me alone itself. What I don't care for personally is the way that the material is presented. The material addresses a 60-minute boil as an absolute must, and the whys and the reasons listed are the 60-minute boil is the only way to avoid these certain characteristics. I can't even count how many times this has been refuted, including in my own brewing practices. Most of the absolutes stated in this part of the exam prep material have been debunked. There's not only exceptions to these rules, but in some cases, these rules are being rewritten and adopted more and more as brewing evolves. However, as I've stated at least a dozen times so far, the material we're presenting is the material the entrance exam is based on. And that entrance exam is an absolute must. It's something you absolutely have to pass to even begin getting certified. So if you're an experienced brewer, you may shake your head at some of the details in this lesson. I'll probably be shaking my head as I record this, but this is the boil information we absolutely need to know to prepare for our entrance exam, pure and simple. So with all that behind us, let's get started here. To start this discussion, it says a minimum of 60 minutes is usually recommended for making quality beer. Boiling for less than an hour runs the risk of a lower bitterness than expected in the beer due to the underutilization of the hop acids, along with a lesser formed head on the final beer from improper extraction of the isohumulones from the hops. Along with the boil length, the study material tells us that a good rolling open boil is necessary. The rolling boil is necessary to bind the hop compounds to the polypeptides. Binding these hop compounds and polypeptides help form a good stable head. An open or uncovered boil, in other words, aids in the removal of unwanted volatile compounds. And these are things like harsh hop compounds, esters, and sulfur. When you cover the boil, this allows those evaporating compounds to recondense on the lid or whatever's covering the boil and then drop back down into the wort, effectively just re-adding them in the process. Clarity will also be affected by not boiling for at least 60 minutes, according to our exam study guide. And that is because the hop break that's produced under 60 minutes is inadequate to remove the undesired proteins that cause beer haze. It also affects the shelf life of the beer as these proteins promote bacterial growth over time. Even in sanitized bottles, kegs, and cans, without an adequate hop break and the addition of these extra proteins, we can reduce the shelf life of our beer. And the preservative qualities of the hops are affected. The full extraction of those preservative compounds aren't fully extracted in less than 60 minutes. Boiling the wort also lowers the pH in beer, and that's something we need to be aware of. Boiling the wort does lower the pH of the beer, and that's something that should be paid attention to. The final pH range after the boil should be in the range of 5.2 to 5.5. If it's lower than 5.2, protein precipitation, that's the proteins that fall out of solution, will be hindered. And with that, the clarity of the beer will also be affected when the pH is below 5.2. A pH below 5.2 will also cause some problems with our fermentation. But we can counter this. Carbonate salts can be added to adjust the pH if the boil does drive down the pH reading below 5.2. We can also use the boil to help us achieve some specific style characteristics. Boiling can form melanoidins. These are compounds that are produced when amino acids and sugars are heated to boiling temperatures. Melanoidins add a darker color and fuller, richer malt flavor to the final beer. Boiling the initial high-gravity runnings, that's the pre-sparged wort that we can take during our lautering step, can quickly caramelize sugars. This isn't necessary for all styles, obviously. For example, it's a good characteristic addition to Scottish ales, but on the other hand, it is not something we would want to do for a light lager. Of course, when we boil, there is going to be evaporation. Vigorous boils evaporate at a range of about 1 gallon per hour. This is going to vary from brew system to brew system as well as where in the world you are boiling. Luckily for our exam, we don't have to consider those variables. Knowing that the average is 1 gallon per hour is the only detail we need to know in accounting for evaporation. Because of evaporation, we need to make adjustments to compensate. In most cases, we're going to start with more liquid than is going to be our target volume, and that's the amount we want to put in the fermenter. Along with that, we're also going to calculate how the condensing of this wort through evaporation is going to change our gravity reading. A more simpler way to say this, and really the only details we need to know for our exam, is we're going to start with more water in our boil than we're going to end with, and the number that we take for a gravity reading at the start of the boil is going to be lower than it will be at the end. Now, if we didn't compensate correctly and we have a less volume of boiled wort than we intended to put in the fermenter, or the gravity measurement is far too high, we can add sterilized water to increase the volume and lower that final gravity. Sterilized water is the key here. We don't want to add straight tap water. Even if that tap water is filtered, it still is very likely to have some kind of bacteria in it. If you're not sure about the sterility of your water, rule of thumb here is to boil it for 10 minutes and then you'll be sure. There are some last notes that were mentioned in our exam study guide, but didn't really fit in any of the previous slides. And if they were mentioned, you know that there is a good chance they'll come up on our exam. So here are those last little pieces of the boil. According to our exam study guide, bittering hops are added at the 60-minute point, or in other words, they are boiled for 60 minutes. They did say there is one exception to this rule, and they said that is the Berliner Weiss style. The guide explains that hops are added to the mash when making a Berliner Weiss. Then the wort is cooled, and then it's fermented with lactobacillus and ale yeast. And lastly, the guide states, when we're brewing an all-grain beer, a 90-minute boil is normal. You may be looking at that and thinking that directly contradicts the entire 60-minute boil segment we had in this lesson, and on the surface it does, but it's not saying that everyone has to be 90 minutes. What it's really saying is, when all said and done, is that every boil has to be 60 minutes, but it's also normal to have a 90-minute one. I don't think this is a point that we need to dwell too much on. If it does come up in the exam, I'd be a little surprised, and it's probably going to be written clear enough to know the difference of what that answer is going to be for the question they're asking. All right, that is it for the information we need to know on the subject of boiling in our wort production in terms of our exam. I can't emphasize that part enough. We do have one more lesson in this section, so let's head on over to that one now.